It was just kind of interesting to see just how well balanced and how easy it is to get a well balanced drink, And so I think the other thing about this journey for me has been, now that I know how to make something simple and easy, what does changing this ingredient do to this cocktail, and what gin do I actually like in this cocktail? Now I can be that person that says, oh, can you make me a Negroni with this type of gin instead of this type of gin?
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails Podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. The goal of this show is to understand the inner workings and evolution of mixology, hospitality, and community. As I further my own knowledge of the field, I'm inviting you to join me. You'll hear me interview people from around the industry about their work and beliefs. If you like what you hear, the best way to keep up is to subscribe via the podcast app you use. And if you think others will like this, I invite you to share an episode or write a review. Your words help grow our audience. And you can keep up with the latest news via our newsletter, Cocktail Confidential, or see what we're working on via Instagram. And please reach out. I'd enjoy hearing what you liked, learned, and what else you'd like to see me dig into. So let's get into it. My guest today is Kayla Williams. By day, she's a public defender. So as Kayla puts it, when the pandemic came along, some people found various crafts at home, and she found craft cocktails. Her hobby, as she says, has been a fun outlet from work, and you can always, you should look her up on her Instagram page at Daily Cordial. Kayla gets quite experimental. It's very impressive. But ultimately, she wants everybody to know great cocktails are accessible everywhere to everyone. So Kayla and I recorded this conversation probably last fall, and obviously took a little while to get the podcast out in general. But as I began looking at ordering and kind of the rollout procession of this, with Kayla having found cocktails right around the beginning of the pandemic, this time actually felt perfect because we're right around the 2-year anniversary of when she would have first found cocktails. So as Kayla recounts in the interview, she remembers being in Nashville with some friends and having some fantastic drinks there, and that really kind of igniting a fire underneath her starting to patronize other local bars in town, and with enough enthusiasm at that point, buying a cocktail book called The New Cocktail Hour by Andre Darlington. I'll have a link to the book in the show notes. But, I think we've all know this story. She found the book. She was excited about it. We took it home. Oh my God, I'm so excited to start making cocktails. And of course, it just languished there. And once she was at home, at the start of COVID in particular, with nothing or little to do, the book opened and it really ignited her passion for cocktails, which is a lot of fun. Kayla had I asked if she had any lessons as a home bartender for people to know. The first thing she says is taste things before you put them in a drink. So whether that's a bottle of gin, bottle of tequila, your Cointreau, an Amaro, Campari, taste that thing on its own. What does it taste like? Better understanding what that tastes like is important, and just as importantly, if you have something else, to taste it alongside. If you have 2 gins, or you have a gin and a vodka, taste those 2 things side by side. Get a feel for what one is going to impart into a drink versus another. Another one was a basic tip for actually stocking the home bar, which was when you're out at a good cocktail bar, what's in the rail right in front of the bartender? What are they reaching for? Someone orders a whiskey sour, and they don't call a particular liquor. What are they reaching for? What are they using? Because a lot of times they're finding good workhorse spirits there that probably aren't going to be terribly expensive and are very passable for pretty much anything. In particular, though, when I asked about what people should have on their bar, Kayla talked about gin. She said a lot of my girlfriends, I don't drink gin, it's just not my thing. And when she, with enough coaxing, got them to lean into and try a gin cocktail and were like, oh my gosh, wow, this is great. This doesn't taste like those bad memories that I have. So something you'll hear me probably talk about all the time in this podcast is inviting you back to try things that you don't think you like. I was in a class last night with a couple of guys, and one of the guys said to me, I don't typically think of myself as a whiskey person, but rather than have whiskey neat or in an old-fashioned, we had it in a whiskey sour style thing. He goes, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. So just my constant invitation to you to say, what don't you think you like, and inviting you back to try it. Speaking of that, one thing she mentioned that I've admit I've had before but know very little about and have messed very little with myself is sloe gin. So what in the heck is sloe gin? So a sloe, S-L-O-E, is actually a cousin of the plum and has kind of so obviously it will impart plum-like, raisin-like, and because it's often when it's steeped in gin, that's how we make a liqueur. So you start with a gin, and then we're steeping these kind of macerated sloes in there. Also, the pits are in there too, and so it gives it a little bit of a nutty quality. This is a liqueur. It's not a spirit, so it's going to be a little bit lower proof. I see that anywhere from 15 to 30%. My guess is the lower the proofing, the sweeter it's going to be. But this is something where it can be a fun new thing to put on the home bar, and I'm planning to use Kayla's reminder of this as an excuse to go out and buy myself a bottle and start messing around with it. We also talk a little bit about, you'll be happy to know that in this interview we cover things you're definitely expecting, like artists Busta Rhymes and Puff Daddy, in that Kayla recounts, in college, being a African-American woman in particular, looking around at her and many of her friends during college, songs like Pass the Courvoisier were big, and so cognac was very big for her, but it took on this connotation for her, especially drinking it in, like we all did, not drinking it in great cocktails when we were younger. It was something she never saw herself drinking again, and she's brought that back onto her shelf. And for me, I would think of that, as I've probably said before, as like rum and tequila, things that I did not think I was going to like, and now I drink as much as anything else. The final thing you'll hear Kayla talk about is a couple of things she likes to batch if friends are coming over, to perhaps give you some tips, and we'll be sure to have some recipes in there. So that covers kind of the basics there, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Kayla. Kayla, thanks for taking time to be on my new podcast here. It's nice to be back in your home right here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great idea, and it's good to have you back. It's weird to not have alcohol in front of us right now.
It's true. Well, and maybe for afterwards, I did bring something I don't think you have to share. Maybe break it out during. So, it's my understanding is when COVID-19 kicked off, you thought to yourself, hey, you know what, maybe since I'm going to be home so much, I'm going to work on cocktails a little bit more. What did your experience with cocktails look like before that? Is there, and sometimes we can't remember a first drink, but is there a bar or a place you remember first having your interest piqued?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was in law school and I went to visit a girlfriend in Nashville. And in Nashville, we went to this kind of speakeasy type bar, and we were speaking with the bartender. The bartender was mentioning that he actually got a lot of his skills from Taste in St. Louis, which was really interesting, and because the drinks were fabulous. And I was like, I haven't been to Taste before. And so I went to Taste. I think I actually went with my husband, and we went to Taste, and the cocktails were fantastic, and just the knowledge that they had when they were explaining these things. And I've always enjoyed a cocktail, but I could never tell you what necessarily I enjoyed about it. I just knew what was good and what wasn't. And so with the way they had this passion to explain these drinks to me, I was like, this is fabulous. So I just kind of frequented the bar scene in St. Louis, or the cocktail scene in St. Louis, enough that my interest continued to peak, And then I went on a girls' trip to, gosh, I can't remember where we went. I actually think it was in Nashville again. And we were, just like the little shops that they have throughout the city. There was a shop, and there was this awesome cocktail book that was just really involved, but it was, going through the origin story of the cocktail. It went through how to make your own syrups and all these things. And I said to myself, oh, one day I'll open this up. And I think that was in 2016. And that book sat on this counter for years, never opened it up, never thought about it. But then when COVID hit, I was like, well, I've got this thing, and I've always loved to cook. I mixed it in with my cocktail, or not my cocktail books, but my recipe books, and it just sat there. And I was like, you know what, let's give this a shot. And I had nothing but time, obviously, with COVID. So I think I went further than your question, but that's kind of how it started and where we are, how we got to where we are now.
No, that's interesting. So basically, vacation kind of had you thinking in a slightly different way about cocktails suddenly, and obviously the St. Louis reference clearly was like, makes you think about it at home. And so the book that you ended up running with during the initial stay-at-home order is the book that you bought in Nashville at that point in time.
Yeah.
And refresh me, what's the title of that book?
So the name of the book is The New Cocktail Hour, and it basically is formed around the premise of just the essentials, what you need to know for any home bartender, just a real family-friendly, not family-friendly, but new user kind of intro to cocktails and how to make those things and how to make drinks and all that stuff. So it was a great, I think, start for me too, because it also gave you what kind of food would go well with this cocktail. It gave you everything that I think people want to know about a cocktail without being intimidating. There's even pictures, so it was a great start for me.
And when you began, obviously plenty of time on your hands at that point, but do you remember it was like you started with recipe 1, or let me see what I have on my existing bar? How did, and obviously whether you remember drink 1 or not is not important, but I guess, what do you feel like your mindset was when you were just starting with that?
I think it was a combination. We always kept alcohol in the house, and I started with this book during COVID, just reading it. I just wanted to flip through, actually see what the book had to offer, and I saw how much easier it was than I thought it would be. And so I looked at what I had on hand, and the cool thing about this book is it says pretty much the essentials you need to have a good cocktail bar. And it just started with gin, and then, you have your basics like a Campari or something just simple that you can to make a base level drink. And so I think potentially the first was a Negroni, just because that's kind of how they formed the book. And we had gin, I could buy Campari because they have it in the grocery store, so it was nothing I had to really search for. And so I think it was a combination of what was easily accessible, what didn't take a lot of act on my part, to do it, and what was I familiar with already. And that's kind of how we started.
And I mean, I do feel like that, I like to say this often, I feel like Campari is kind of like the olives or cilantro of the food world.
Yeah, that's true.
People are either on Team Campari or they are off.
Yeah.
100%. But yeah, a classic like a Negroni, like how much, again, to someone who's on the outside looking in, but yeah, just measure the, 3 ingredients same time in the same amount. Yeah. It's kind of, it is pretty foolproof. Whether or not you're going to like Campari or not, that's a whole other question right there.
Yeah. It was just kind of interesting to see just how well balanced and how easy it is to get a well balanced drink, and so I think the other thing about this journey for me has been, now that I know how to make something simple and easy, what does changing this ingredient do to this cocktail, and what gin do I actually like in this cocktail? Now I can be that person that says, oh, can you make me a Negroni with this type of gin instead of this type of gin? So you can become a snob if you want to be, but it's nice to see just how simple it is, and then you can get more exploratory on that once you have those basics.
And, each of us has our own taste palette, flavor profile. But are there things that you've learned in general you're more drawn towards, or even obviously with friends, or maybe even a few of the people who've happened upon your handle on Instagram, Daily Cordial? Are there things that you found that you either didn't know that you liked, or ingredients you feel like people are like misunderstand? People are like, oh, like I didn't know you could work with that. So
yeah, it's I guess for the latter part of your question, absinthe is really interesting to me because I was not familiar with a rinse before. I thought it had to be, a pour like the rest of the ingredients, and it was a little aggressive. The licorice is always a little aggressive to me, but now that I've found that you just rinse the glass with that, it provides like the perfect balance. Or even like a chartreuse, sometimes that can be I can have it or I can leave it sort of person, because it can be a little aggressive to me at times. So I think learning about the technique of rinsing with some of those things that can be a little more dominant in a cocktail is just a cool thing that I've gathered. I think my taste preferences, I love a good boozy, heavy cocktail that you can use with just a slow melt cube. Like that's kind of what my preference is. I prefer the agave family. That's my jam, my all-time favorite cocktail that Jeff always makes fun of me for trying to order at every single bar, no matter if it's a cocktail bar or not, is a Oaxaca Old Fashioned. That is my all-time favorite. So I found that I found that with agave liquors, the nature and the complexity of those flavors can be just as dominant as a bourbon or whiskey cocktail that is so much more mainstream. So I think that's where I've settled in my cocktail journey.
And so a Oaxacan Old Fashioned would typically be 1.5 ounces of tequila,
yep.
Probably reposado, and then a 1/2 ounce of mezcal. Do you find yourself following that, or have you adjusted it over time, or hey, once you fall into a rhythm with something, why break it? So has your interest in diving deeper with it, or is it just kind of tried and true? Let me not even think about when I'm making this kind of
I
thing.
prefer mezcal to tequila, so I like to flip the proportions a lot of times, or make it an even split for the two of them. But yeah, at a restaurant, the tried and true, just do the 1.5 reposado and a 1/2 ounce of mezcal is what I am happy to take, because I think just that is easy. But my preference is I like a little bit more smoke. I let it a little bit more bite that you get from the mezcal, so I like to flip those proportions when I'm making it at home.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that's certainly reminds me of my buddy Brandon, who's also fairly avid, and and I think this is also an important thing just for people in general, is that he would be for like a straight mezcal margarita, and I like mezcal a lot, but to me, he wants to go full 2 ounce pour, and I'm like, I'm gonna put half tequila or even maybe 3/4 tequila, because at moments it can be just more than I want. And I feel like that's the other thing too, is like, because I don't know if you have a thought on this, because I feel like when people see a recipe, they're like, okay, so this is handed down from God, and I can't doctor this, but I feel like that's one of the biggest things, is finding this comfort with experimenting a little bit.
Well, and it's, you came for my birthday, and we really focused on modifiers and how to just play with your basic recipes, and that was something that I was doing a little bit, but now it provided a bigger comfort. So just when we were talking about the vermouths, and just how the more better, sorts of concepts that we can introduce into cocktails, and, just understanding what the proportions are so you understand the balance, but you can play with it and flip it depending on your taste. And I think the most simple thing that I'd never considered was taste these things before you put them in a drink, And I had never really thought about that, because I think part of it was like, oh, don't waste the, the product. But, and since I've started trying to just riff and do things at home, I have just taken a sip of something. I was like, that would be good with this, and let me taste that again to make sure. And so then I just kind of build off of that. But yeah, it's so true that these recipes, we think, if I don't do this, and if I don't use the same type of alcohol they even recommend, then I'm screwing up the recipe.
Right. Yeah, it's like, this calls for Beefeater and all I have is Tanqueray. And it's like, no, actually, like it'll be just fine, right?
Yeah.
And you may need to adjust it a little bit, but that is the play side. And I think it gets to two things. One, not speaking about these things in such reverential tones that people feel like they can't play a little bit.
Yeah.
But second, also, like, there are understandably very expensive craft spirits out there.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know what? Maybe don't break out the, 25-year aged whatever.
Yeah.
Having more cocktail spirits is certainly another approach right there.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something about the cocktail community that I love it. I love that you can become this person that's such an expert that it's intimidating to people. But I also find, especially since doing this at home and talking to coworkers and friends, just like, I'm doing this so I can show everybody can do it. And, I may not have the proper gear, but you can work with what you've got, and just have fun with it, because it's a tangible outcome at the end of the day, and you get a benefit from it, so I love that you can get pretentious, and I love that you can get really, in deep, but also it's so simple and so accessible for so many people.
Yeah. What do you think about, so you mentioned, obviously a lot of the time you've spent doing this has been during the pandemic, and we all have had different lifestyles during the pandemic, but I know that you and Jeff have at least go do a little bit of this or that.
Yeah.
I'm always interested in, and I have my own thoughts on this, when it comes to something like the liquor store or going to a bar, and not all bars are created equal, not all bars are meant to be cocktail bars. When you look at a menu in a restaurant or a bar, are there levels of descriptions that are helpful, that are missing? Do you like it if something's very vague, if it's very specific? What is your thought on what bars you think maybe, and maybe not by name per se, but like what bars are doing well and what they could be doing better to appeal to people?
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think now I can handle vague because I recognize some of what they're talking about, and I can picture those proportions. I can picture this cocktail in my head. But I think for the average person, you should say, because sometimes they even just say like a brand, and they don't necessarily say what that is. And so some people just don't even know what that is. I prefer you say brandy versus, Pierre Ferrand. You know what I mean? I prefer you say what the ingredient is. And I don't need proportions. I don't think any bar has ever done that. Like, oh, we do 2 ounces of this. I don't need any of that. But I do think there's some places that it's cool where they're like, this is a stirred cocktail versus a shaken, which would be, I think, really neat to see. And so you have an idea of, well, okay, this may not have ice. This may be served neat. This may, this is going to be much more involved and tiki-like. So there's categories there. When I was in Los Angeles recently, we went to Death and Company, and they break it by how strong the drink's going to be. They break it down by, stirred versus shaken. And so I think that's a really cool, you feel engaged. And I think even the average user could have a conversation with the wait staff and just ask for recommendations based on that.
Right. That is certainly part of my thing is, I I've heard, people say, like, if you give someone too much interpretation, that they'll then just see what you've painted for them as opposed to, but I think sometimes someone sees a Vieux Carré, a Manhattan riff, and like, they have no association to that is. So even if they know what a Manhattan is, even though it says bourbon, brandy, vermouth, Benedict, they're just like, their brains can't handle it. And I mean that in the most loving way possible.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if bars are like, if they want to sell things more, what else do they owe someone in terms of boozy, lighter?
Yeah.
You're probably going to smell little bits of this, taste little bits of this. Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like that could be helpful at times.
That's a really interesting thought. I agree with that. And I do think it provides a little bit more ownership in the person, the customer. I think it does allow them to feel, again, less intimidated. This is something that I'm comfortable having conversations about. Or maybe if they did break it down by the familiar, okay, here's the old-fashioned categories, here's your margarita categories, things like that, which are so much more familiar, and comfortable for people.
Right. Yeah, because even if you take something like a margarita and a sidecar, I mean, you have brandy versus tequila, lime versus lemon, but they still are, to a degree, more similar than different.
Yeah.
And at least the margarita gives you like this reference point, as opposed to us hoping that you figure out what that is.
Yeah.
So, and I do agree with you as well in terms of like brand names or whatnot. Tim Wiggins from Yellow Belly was telling me that like one of the things that I know that's on their menu, when they're going to use like an orgeat, like an almond syrup, he'll just write almond instead, because most people are like, what? I don't even know how to say this.
What is orgeat? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just feel like giving additional help like that is good. Do you have any thoughts on, as well, when you are shopping for stuff? One, you have, a corner store, so to speak. You also have like these liquor emporiums that you just go on for days.
Yeah.
What to you is interesting versus, and maybe as you and I better know how to navigate these things, maybe sometimes they're less overwhelming.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts? Or I don't know if you and friends have gone out to like the liquor store and like just watch, I don't know. So anyways, I'm curious to get your thoughts on liquor stores. Basically.
Yeah. I do think there is such a thing as too much, I think there's too many options a lot of times. I also think we get caught up in, I think we may have talked about this, but pricing. And I think sometimes just because they think something's expensive, it is better. I would think, just like the menu conversation, it would be great if these liquor stores could break it down. Great cocktail, great sipping, great, you know what I mean? And just kind of break it down so people understand what they're looking for. If you're going to go put Coca-Cola in something, don't go buy, this category of stuff. It is, I don't know. I like to stay local for my shopping. I try not to do like the Total Wine hub, but sometimes that's the only option, because they have more.
They have bigger reach, for
right?
Sure.
Yeah, more ability to get things. But I try to stay as local as I can, and the smaller shops have a little bit more of an ability to engage with you, and I can say, this is what I've enjoyed, and this is kind of what I'm looking for, because there are so many brands and brown is something I'm still trying to get really familiar with. To me, I need to know, what about this whiskey? Is it going to be a real fire rye, or is it going to be something a little smoother? Because this is what I'm looking for in my Manhattan, stuff like that. So I like having conversations with the staff, and I prefer it to be a staff member that is actually familiar with the product versus, will people always buy this sort of product? So I like engaging. I like having conversations. And I try to look at the distributor, try to see if there's, similarities there that I'm familiar with in the product, like the Buffalo Trace family, they make good things and stuff like that. So I try to stay small, I try to stay local, and I try to engage when I have questions, just to say, this is what I've liked, this is what I've enjoyed, I'm happy to try something new.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is has begun to come back a little bit here and there. But, if there is a liquor store out there near you that has a tasting bar, because a number of these places for, sometimes if it's on feature, they're just giving out samples, but throw down $2, $3, $4 for a pour of something before you go and spend $30 on it.
Totally agree. Yeah.
And it's a great moment too. And the harder part, and this is like, unless you want to spend all day at the liquor store, which not a bad idea, but also what you're going to buy, taste it even against what you know. So you're a big Broker's fan,
right,
and now you're thinking about getting some Boodle's gin. Get a taste of them side by side.
Yeah.
Because so often we're trying to recall what whiskey tastes like.
Yeah.
As opposed to being confronted with that A/B test.
Yeah.
Is a great way to suddenly be like, okay, this is, but how spicy or whatever is this compared to X?
And I also try to look at the rail in quotes of some of my favorite cocktail, like Planters and Yellow Belly, and going to taste and seeing what are you using just in your basic cocktails, so I know, well, that's good, and I know it's not going to be uber expensive to buy for myself, and then that gives me an understanding of what these flavors are, so I can take it and have and build upon that with my liquor store run.
That's a real good one, and probably something that I've done. I do, but a great tip to people is like another great reason to sit at the bar is like look at the rail that they're working from, because those are great workhorses that are going to be highly reliable to put on the bar at that point.
To make sure it's a cocktail bar. Like if you're going
of
to
course.
the rail of pop off, it's not necessarily what we're talking about. But I think that those places know what works and what's good and what's reasonably priced. So it's a good starting point.
So you've talked a little bit about the agave family, and so one, be interested to hear more about that. But in terms of things that you've kind of really fallen for, that you think more people might be, and taste is still relative, but things that you think more people should be putting on their shelves at home, what has surprised you, or have you kind of gotten more into?
Well, I've had girlfriends that were 100% like, I just don't drink gin. I do not like gin. And, we've had parties since, or I've had people over and I'll make a gin cocktail and they're like, this doesn't taste like gin at all. This is fabulous, And so I do think, and I got that from back to this book, I got that from here, because they say like the base most often for these original classics is a gin-based cocktail, And so I've gotten to explore the differences. I had no clue what slow gin was before, and it's a fabulous product, and it's red, and it's something that nobody would ever imagine to be a gin. So I think gin should be on people's shelves. I think they should definitely try it out, because juniper is intimidating and aggressive for some people, but there are gins out there that are not heavy on the juniper berry at all, so that has been fun to see. Brandy and cognac, I never thought I would ever have on my shelves. I guess for me it was like the college liquor that I couldn't ever have again, but I've fallen in love with that, and seen, like we talked about with the sidecar, and just seeing how you can make these cocktails with that you can change from the basic bourbon whiskey ingredient and substitute that for a little bit more of a dynamic flavor profile. So I think if I'm going to tell somebody to start with something that they wouldn't ordinarily buy, I'd say gin for sure, because I think it can be used in a lot of ways that's surprising to people.
I just earlier this week, I had a class with a group of business owners, and most of them were probably, I would say probably it's fair, late 40s to early 60s. And our final drink that night was a Tom Collins. And more than one of them were like, oh, I just don't do gin. And I do think so much of it is when you talked about your college moments right there. We were subjecting ourselves to lots of and often not very good quality product. And we made it, I know I don't like that thing. And to me, that's why my personal mission is rum, because rum to most people is Captain Morgan. And I think I can remember buying unnecessary amounts of like Gilby's gin in college and being like, I mean, that Christmas tree smell right there, that takes me to places I don't want to go.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's why so many people, I've never been offended by tequila, but I think it's the same for tequila. But I feel like tequila is getting more trendy now. So people are trying to get back on you've got celebrities starting a bunch of tequila brands. But right. I think gin is just one of the, I used to get told I was a hobo for drinking it. You know what I mean? So that's, but I agree with you, rum too. It's just, there's so many things that we drink such trash early on that we don't realize that there's just such good stuff out there.
Do you, so for me, going first, I'm pretty sure it was my buddy Ryan, going back to college. At some point, he was just aware of, I honestly even think through like old 70s or 80s movies, like gin gimlets. And so we were drinking garbage gimlets in college. And now to realize like, oh, this is very different, and much better. Yeah. For your, like if you were having brandy or cognac, and what, do you remember what informed that you would try that instead of what I had, a gimlet or whatever?
Yeah.
What made that your drink of choice? Do you remember?
I think it was just, music videos, really, like the rap culture, probably. Like 100% Hennessy and Sprite is what we were sipping on all the time, and it was awful. Absolutely awful. But, and not to say that Hennessy is terrible or anything, it's just like which I don't have it on my shelf, but I think that, again, it brings it back to just that trauma that we imposed on ourselves.
Yeah. I actually was, and I don't know if you've dug into this, I actually just the other day, my girlfriend shared with me, and I listened to an interview about how, in addition to that, how cognac in particular became so endeared, and how it even predates that, because they talked about African American soldiers stationed abroad during World War II. Have you heard this story?
No.
So stationed abroad during World War II, becoming very used to it. Also, former St. Louisan Josephine Baker, who put up residence there, became like one of their ambassadors. So they're being served by her.
Okay.
And for a long time, not surprising in this country, when soldiers came back, whiskey brands were trying to court them, but also getting a lot of mixed messages as well. And that the cognac community saw an opportunity and really did that. And then in the 80s and 90s, they'd begun languishing again, and it was Diddy and it's Busta Rhymes, for Pass the
Courvoisier, yeah.
And when they saw Courvoisier, all the other companies went out and moved back into the community again. And so they talked about, at least, that at moments when, and that's a very long conversation, at another moment of our country, doing awful things, that the French companies saw an opportunity to kind of create great brand reputation, recognition, and really generate a lot of loyalty in the long run.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it was the, not necessarily the brand, but it was the genre or category of alcohol that if we were like, what is something that we will enjoy because it's represented,
right?
The Remy, the Hennessy, the Courvoisier, like that is, cognac is the thing. And so that's what I often would see people bring to parties and stuff like that. You've got your vodkas and all that stuff, but if you were going to have something, that was the thing.
I'll tell you, I mean, I guess, country music does it too in its own way as well. But at moments, God bless hip hop for being very apparent about like what is being consumed, right?
This is our category.
100%. Yeah. If I've ever seen a true hustler of those things, it's Rick Ross, man. He is relentless.
That's so funny. It's so true. I mean, you want to talk about marketing. Yeah, it's a smart play. But I have opened myself back up to it, and I've found that I really do enjoy it, and I actually can sip it neat now. Once you get back into a back into a groove of actually informing myself on what actually is a good product and not over serving myself. That's always key. But yeah, I think we all have it. But I say, get back to it, because there's just such a good variety of options out there for us now.
Sure. Beyond the Oaxaca Old Fashioned, guests are coming over, and you don't want to trouble yourself too much.
Yeah.
But you're either going to prep in advance, or there's one thing you're going to be ready for 6, 8, 10 people.
Yeah.
What do you think it is you might want to share at the time? And clearly there's like what's top of mind in the moment. But yeah, I guess I don't know if there's like a crowd pleaser that comes to mind for you.
I think, what I always like to do, especially if I was going to go to a dinner party, it's so easy to batch a Manhattan. And I really like Rittenhouse Rye. It's like a $20 bottle, but I think it really can hold its own in something so simple, and I'm not spending a ton of time and money to make it. I'll batch a couple Manhattan bottles for people and bring that. And it's just so good if you have a good one, that's welcoming enough for people that aren't intimidated and they know what they're getting. If I'm trying to think, usually I try not to make too many tequila things for friends on the jump, because they just don't prefer it, and I try not to force things onto people. But I'm trying to think what I would make. But off the top, I just know that I batch Manhattans most frequently for people, and I just bring that with me. There's usually a big citrus focus for me for like gatherings or parties and things like that, but I just can't think off the top of my head. One of my friends, her favorite thing is a sidecar, so for her birthday I made sidecar batches and stuff like that. But I try to focus on batching as much as I can, for especially during COVID. It's like, just bringing something everybody can pour themselves, and you don't have me necessarily spending time to make a cocktail. But
when you get into batching in that way, and this is something that, frankly, I sometimes still wrestle with myself. So are you making the big punch bowl? Are you mixing it in a bottle and like having people pour it out and shake it?
Yeah.
Do you have a thought on that one way or the other?
Yeah, I do think so. With batching, I try not to batch anything that requires like bubbles, or because obviously you don't want to batch that, because then you've got to make it on top of where you are. So I try to do cocktails or batch cocktails that don't need anything other than maybe put an ice cube in your glass to do the dilution. I still haven't quite figured out the perfect dilution with batching. So I tell people this needs to be served with ice. This needs to be melted down a little bit so you don't have just a strong cocktail. But yeah, my approach is generally just to do something maybe not even always citrus, because I think that can turn if you want to keep it for a little bit. So my batching approach is always the liquor forward cocktails that don't need much work, but just an incorporated stir that I can even keep incorporating in the bottle itself, and then pour over some cubes if you have it.
And I don't know, so I guess it's fun to look at a selection people put together. So if you've begun to maybe move past the cocktail hour book, or maybe you're still working through it, are there other resources you've found useful in terms of your own self-learning journey at this point in time?
Yeah, we've talked about it. The certain goals for me are to do more with the syrup family, the simple family, do more incorporating of fresh ingredients and infusing cocktails or infusing liquor. I'm really interested in something that I've always found intimidating was the bitters category. I do think they can really change a drink. In the Oaxaca, the Angostura is the thing that really ties it all together, I think. So I actually recently bought a book that just is telling you about bitters, how to make them, and then hopefully I can spend time playing with making my own bitter batches, and just to get more familiar with what these do to a cocktail and how these change the drink once you've played. I have your basic orange Angostura and like a chocolate bitter. But other than that, I don't really know. I mean, I've got the Peychauds and I've got Creole, but I don't use them much unless the recipe calls for it. So that is I'm trying to get more familiar with those sorts of modifiers that I can play with and actually make the drink my own. And then I'm now trying to just get more familiar, like with especially my love for agave. I've gotten a couple books in that family, and so now I'm drinking Sotal, which isn't even an agave, but it's very similar to mezcal. So I'm learning more, and I've actually just getting more even for the sipping types of liquors that don't need a cocktail, because I've just like, oh, this is just so good. And sometimes I just want really good alcohol. And now that I'm familiar with it, I'm comfortable purchasing this versus this. So, but in the cocktail realm, yeah, I'd say the bitters and infusions and things like that are what I'm trying to work on.
Got it. So we talked about, kind of coming back to brandy after a while. Are there ingredients or styles of drinks out there you've tried where you're just like, this is never going to be a thing for me at all?
I joke because I've never met a cocktail I didn't like. No, I don't think so. I can't think of anything that I was just like, I can't do this anymore. Because I still love a good margarita, and I think you cannot go wrong, adding, and I just think you can do so much with a margarita. It's like you can add spice, you can add different citrus, you could, combine a reposado with a mezcal, you can just do blanco, so there's so many things. So I just can't think of any cocktail category or type that I've had that is too much, or I've done it too many times, anything like that. I can't think of anything. I'm trying to explore more on the non-familiar side so I can, just broaden my knowledge, but I can't think of anything.
Cool. Yeah. So we have, if people are getting started, people should probably think about putting more tequila on on their shelves at home. Any other tips or thoughts out there for people that are kind of like they've gotten started, but they're looking to push things to the next level? Drinks you'd recommend they try, or just other things you'd recommend they put on the home bar at this point?
Well, I think vermouths are really important because I think they can add a sweetening aspect to your drinks without you needing the simple all the time, which I think is great. But I wasn't familiar with the refrigeration requirement because of the base that's different than a liqueur, which has the alcohol, it's like a wine base. And so the fermentation that's happening. So that's always something, if you're going to buy those things, which is great, just make sure you have room in your fridge, which I barely have room for. But that's just something that I don't think you necessarily are told, or it's such an assumption, I think, for people that they wouldn't know that. But things to definitely have in your bar, I would say don't buy simple, make it yourself. It's so much cheaper and so much easier. So don't buy it. And then for what you must supply, I don't know. I can't remember where I started, but I think you get yourself a good base alcohol, if it's gin, if it's tequila, if it's whiskey, if it's rum. Get yourself a bitter type of modifier, Cynar, or if it's I don't know, what else do I like on the bitter side? A Campari, something, I think, depending on how bitter you like it. I like a good bitter cocktail. And then get a sweetener, a vermouth, a blanc vermouth, or a red vermouth that can help balance some of these cocktails. And then just play with it. And then citrus is your friend, I think, for all things. So don't be intimidated by lemon, lime, or grapefruit. Play with those.
For a number of people out there, if they'd hear the term Cynar, they'd be like, maybe I've seen that.
Yeah.
What is that? Are there... so it has an artichoke base to it, even though that doesn't necessarily always present in the boldest manner. Is there and obviously sometimes I can't think of recipes off the top of my mind, but in terms of things you enjoy doing with Cynar, anything come to mind quickly?
Yeah.
Or off the top of your head, I should say.
I like Cynar with, I actually really like it with mezcal. I like it with a rye whiskey as well, and bourbon. I think it is not as aggressive for those that don't like Campari. It's definitely not as bitter, but I think that in a stirred cocktail can add just a little bit of bite to take away any level of sweetness, and I think it can help with a heavy, boozy, feel if you're just tasting the alcohol. I think it provides a little dynamic. There's no necessary recipe that I can think of. I mean, there's like the chokehold or something like that, but I think if you want to mix it in and add a little bit of bite to your cocktail, a half ounce, is a good addition, I think, for me.
And so is that like in a Manhattan format?
Yeah.
You're thinking, okay,
yeah.
So I've got 2 ounces of my añejo tequila or my whiskey.
Yeah.
And in addition to the vermouth, I'm putting in a little bit of Cynar.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And stir that and just drink it either with a cube or drink it neat.
Yep. And just drink some Cynar on the rocks.
Yeah.
While you're at it, folks.
Yeah.
So I think so far that's kind of the questions I had. Mm-hmm. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to share regarding your practice, what you've learned over the past? I'd love to hear whatever you have to share.
Oh, it's been fun. I always get clam up because I'm like, I don't know necessarily. I would not put myself out to be an expert by any means. I just think if you like cooking, if you're one of those people that likes to just kind of experiment with things, you can totally do that. And it makes so much sense with the cocktails because it's just what flavors work with what. As long as you understand the basic proportion of, what kind of cocktail you like, then you feel free to mix and match. But I also say that those that don't like experimentation are more on the baker side of things. It's also great because you know exactly what you need, and those proportions will never, steer you wrong. So I just want everybody to know I have no particular skill. I like to drink, and that's where we started, and that's where I am ending, but feel free to look at my page. I don't do anything fun. It's just telling people it's so easy to do.
Yeah, out on Daily Cordial on Instagram. But I would say, putting in that much time in the trenches, but really behind the bar, to be able to talk about things like Cynar and chartreuse and whatnot, shows, whether or not a person wants to own being an expert, the amount at this point certainly reflects what happens when you apply yourself to something. So, and I will say, when I see some of the riffs you're making up, I'm like, man, she is going for it, which is fun. Because at home, I'm a fairly, I'm always interested in understanding what's happening behind a recipe, but I am less of a riff maker when I'm at home. I'm really more, why is this here? And I suppose what can go in its place, and you're just putting it into practice all the time. I'm workshopping, but I appreciate how often you're like, hey, I was feeling this, and so I ran in this direction. I like that confidence there.
I think the scientific approach that you have is just so much more beneficial because you retain the information and you get the knowledge and you have a base for it, and then you understand it, where I can't always express or explain what I've learned, just because I've just never been that type of person. But I feel like my gut tells me this and this is what it is, but I could never relay that to another person, to tell them how to do it, unless they watch, and then in the moment things are coming and I can tell them. So I really like your approach, and even just the breakdown when you came for my birthday, and it was like, flip this over and you've got, a more aperitif style cocktail but you can explain that in such a way, even when you were like, margarita, take this out, add this, change the citrus, you've got this new cocktail, you've got, the daisy family. So I just think it's such a better approach if you were trying to be a teacher, and that's why you're so great at it, where I'm just like, we're going to figure it out. And if it sucks, it sucks.
That's right. All I know is in a minute, we're about to have a cocktail.
Yeah. No, so just have fun with it. I'm enjoying it. It was nice that I got an opportunity to slow down and actually look at the things I've purchased, but then finding a new hobby that I do promise I don't get hammered every night. I probably make one or two, but that's about it. Because there is something about the effort it takes to make a cocktail, which I don't want to say is extensive, but just the act of making it kind of slows you down, versus just being at the bar and ordering them. So I really have enjoyed the cocktails a lot more than I used to just drinking them. I think I appreciate them, and I appreciate the cost for these cocktails nowadays. More than I used to.
You can definitely see why when you see what's going into it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking some time today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you so much.
You bet. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you liked the interview, the transcript and show notes are located at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. The Decoding Cocktails Podcast is produced by Chris Bay and myself, Chris LeBeau. Subscribe to avoid missing an episode, and if you think this is good stuff, share it with a friend or review us on your listening platform. And check out our newsletter, Cocktail Confidential. Remember, the best way to get better at mixology is to practice. And the best way to do that is in the company of friends and family. Happy cocktailing, everybody.